Across the counter from me, almost every week, somebody slides over a reel they're certain is worth nothing. Corroded, off-brand. A handle knob cracked straight through. They want $20, and they'll take 10. And every so often, not often, but enough, I get about 4 seconds to decide whether to tell them the truth. That the ugly little thing sitting between us is worth more than a month of their paychecks. Most people on my side of a counter never say a word. I'm going to say all of it. You've probably sized up an old reel the same way nearly everyone does. 3 questions. Does it still turn? Is it a name I recognize? Does it look clean and complete? Every one of those questions points in exactly the wrong direction. The reel that looks perfect is usually a mass production model from the 1990s. $12 at a swap meet on a good day. The corroded one, with a faded stamp and that cracked knob, can be the one a serious collector has been tracking on sold listings for a year and a half. Condition matters. Brand matters. Just not the way the shelf taught you. What actually moves the money is a different question, and it starts with a stretch of years almost no casual seller has ever heard named. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll read a real foot the way the buyer across the counter already does. Picture a narrow doorway cut into time, roughly the late 1940s to the early 1970s. For about 25 years, a small group of American, British, and Japanese makers were turning out reels at a level that, for the price, simply hasn't been matched since. Short production runs, tight machining, solid metal instead of filled plastic, and a stamp on the foot that told you which country stood behind it. When Abu was still building its round bait casters in Svängsta, Sweden, the tolerances were close enough that a 50-year-old reel can still run smoother than something off today's shelf. Then comes the part the catalog never prints: the acquisitions, the consolidations, the quiet arithmetic of who owns what. The name on the box stayed the same, the factory moved, the country changed, and the reel inside that same logo became a different object. Here's the piece worth sitting with, and it isn't a conspiracy, it's an ownership chart. The company behind your Abu reel today, Pure Fishing, is held by a private equity firm called Sycamore Partners. Under that single roof sit Penn, Pfluger, Mitchell, Shakespeare, Fenwick, and even Hardy of England, the very names whose 1960s versions a collector will cross 3 states to find are, today, line items in one portfolio. And a company like that has no reason on earth to point you back toward the reel in your garage. You can't patent a manufacturing window that closed 50 years ago. You can't sell a man his grandfather's reel again every spring in fresh packaging. This isn't kept from you out of malice. It's overlooked because there's nothing in it to sell. Collectors read these cutoff dates the way a wine buyer reads a bad vintage year. The person across the counter knows the conversation is happening. You just weren't invited. Until now. So, 15 reels that keep getting priced like junk, counting up to the one that hides in plain sight more than all the rest. We start in the most ordinary place in America, the kitchen junk drawer. Number 15 is the Zebco, the push-button spin caster half the country learned to fish with. And I'll be straight with you. Most of them are worth about $5, and always will be. But the earliest standard models, from the 1950s, weren't built like the plastic that followed. Metal body. Gears that were actually cut, not stamped from cheap pot metal. The tell sits on the face and the foot, a metal cone over the front instead of a plastic face, and an all-metal body underneath. Flip it, and the gap between a junk drawer reel and the one a Zebco collector wants is right there in your palm. The mistake is assuming every old Zebco in a box marked vintage is the good one. Almost none are. Plastic face, move on. But that one habit, flipping the reel over and reading it instead of trusting the label, is the entire game. And from here, it gets expensive. Number 14 probably caught the biggest fish your family ever landed, the Penn Senator. Green and gold, built like a winch, and still made in some form today. That longevity is exactly the trap. Because parts interchange across decades, most Senators sell for $60 to $100 as working tools, and that's fair. Collectors play a narrower game. They hunt the versions from before 1980, specific sizes, like the 113H and the 114H, with their original drag stack and metal side plates that were never chrome polished. Look for crisp molded seams, original parts. A reel that was used, not rebuilt. Now here's where instinct betrays people. A senator that's been polished bright, or had its drag swapped for new parts, is worth a fraction of an all-original one that looks physically worse. And one more warning. Collectors will tell you handle color is a rough generational clue, but handles unscrew in seconds. Treat color as a hint, never as proof. The proof is whether the reel left the factory the way it sits in your hand. Hold that idea. It's about to decide everything. Number 13. Taught the American tackle trade how to wind line evenly across the spool. The Shakespeare-level wind. Walk any flea market and you'll find a pile of them, $5 to $50 each. So how do you find the one reel in the pile? You read the foot for a date. From the early 1930s on, Shakespeare stamped a two-letter date code. If you see that code, you're holding mass production. The real money sits before the codes existed. The earliest models, some literally stamped handmade with a serial number in the German silver upper lines. The way I put it across the counter, a date code is a barcode before there were barcodes, convenient for the factory, fatal to the price. No code, a serial number, jeweled end caps, and you've found a survivor the pile pickers walked right past. Which raises the question that decides a third of this list. Why does older sometimes mean worthless? Number 12 answers it. The Mitchell 300 put spinning reels into millions of hands, and I mean millions. They were built in such enormous numbers, over so many years, that age alone tells you nothing here. The dusty one in your garage is, almost certainly, a $25 reel. But before Garcia absorbed the brand in the early 1970s, the French-made Mitchells carried a different quality in the metal. A cleaner casting on the bale wire, a harder finish on the spool. The rarest is the very first version, a rosewood knob, a round anti-reverse switch, and a half bale instead of a full one. Check the foot, made in France, sends you straight to the knob and the bale. Rosewood and a half bale, and you've found the unicorn. Aluminum knob, full bale. Welcome to the millions. A clean, heavy bale on an early French-marked Mitchell can climb past $600 at a specialist auction on a quiet week. The lesson holds. It was never about old. It was about which side of a doorway the reel was built on, and the next reels prove that a name on the badge can be the biggest lie of all. Number 11 is really three names that ride together in the same rusty estate boxes: South Bend, Bronson, and Langley. Most are modest factory reels, $5 to $40. But the vintage market hides a thread that runs under all of them. The name on the badge is often not the hand that built the reel. A designer named Cox built genuinely high-end big-game reels and patented a famous star dragged generations back. Bronson took the operation over in the 1930s. So a reel stamped Coxy, or Coxy Bronson, is a different animal from a $5 Bronson caster. And the earliest German silver South Bend, the jeweled number 1131, was, by collector accounts, actually built by Shakespeare. Across the counter, the rule is simple. Read past the badge to the engineering. The label tells you who sold it. The metal tells you who made it. Hold on to that, because the single most expensive reel on this entire list wears a brand name that wasn't its maker at all. Number 10 is the Pfluger Supreme, out of Akron, Ohio, and most are everyday baitcasters, $5 to $50. But the models built before the 1960s carry an anti-reverse mechanism collectors still consider better than anything at its original price. The Grail is the first Supreme, from the early 1920s. It had an automatic free spool, an anti-backlash adjustment, and, rare for a factory reel of that age, a serial number. The tell is in the screws. Spin the spool in gear. If it free spools on its own, look closer. Simple slotted screws, instead of modern cross slots, mean an early one. Photograph that reel without flipping it to show the foot and the screws, and you've left the identification, and the price, lying on the table. Sellers do it every single day, but the next reel is the one that fools even good pickers, because it looks like nothing, and it's wearing the wrong name. Number 9 carries a name that means 5-figure auctions to most people. Hedden, out of Dowagiac, Michigan. But those sky-high numbers belong to Hedden's hand-carved wooden lures, not as a rule its reels. Here's the secret folded into the company's own history. When Hedden decided to build reels in the early days, they didn't start from nothing. They brought in craftsmen trained in the Kentucky reel tradition, men who had come up through the legendary B.F. Meek shop. So the finest Hedden reels, the full jeweled tournament models with aluminum spools, are really Kentucky craftsmanship wearing a Michigan badge. The early ones reach into the hundreds. The later, ordinary Hedden reels are nearly worthless. An analogy from the counter. It's a master's painting, signed with the gallery's name. The value was never in the badge, it was always in the hand. And speaking of hands, there's a New Jersey name almost nobody can pronounce, which is exactly why it slips through estate sales for pennies. Number 8 is Meiselbach, a Newark, New Jersey shop-building take-apart casting reels before 1910. Most people can't say the name, which is precisely why it slides through unnoticed. The common nickel-plated versions are $20 to $60. The secret is in the metal. You want the German silver versions, the free spool take-apart deluxe models with jeweled bearings. Look for Takapart or Tripart stamped on the reel, with a stack of patent dates on the tailplate. And weight tells the truth. If the body feels surprisingly heavy because it's solid German silver and not thin-plated brass, you're holding something scarce. Light and cheap, or heavy and quiet. The difference is the whole price. And the 4 reels still ahead are where the numbers stop sounding real. Before we climb into the top of this list, one thing. Everything we've covered so far, the manufacturing window, the cutoff dates, the exact tells on each reel, and the sources, so you can check every word against the record yourself, is gathered onto a single page you can tape inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on screen, and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay, because the next 4 reels are where the numbers stop sounding believable, and where one wrong move with a rag can erase all of it in a single afternoon. Number 7 is where a plain little brass reel can stop your breath. Antique fly and raised pillar reels, all brass or German silver, made before 1920. An unmarked one might bring $50 to $150. A marked maker changes the entire picture. A raised pillar fly reel from the Philbrook and Payne workshop, among the earliest great American fly reels, sits in the $15,000 to $20,000 range at major tackle auctions. For a tiny piece of brass. But here's the trap that catches even seasoned pickers. Some of the most valuable reels carry a brand that wasn't the maker. A reel stamped Cosmic, for instance, was by collector accounts, often built by the great Julius von Hofe, and simply badged for a sporting goods house. Never trust the stamp. Read the engineering. We just heard that name, von Hofe. And we'll hear it again at number 3, because it is the single most misunderstood name in this entire trade. But first, the reel that quietly turns ordinary garages into gold mines. Number 6 is the round red baitcaster from Sweden that rewrote casting, the Abu Ambassadeur 5000. When Abu was still machining these in Svängsta, the tolerances were so tight that a half-century-old reel still outruns plenty of brand-new ones. But you have to know the doorway. The later models, built after the brand changed hands, are everywhere, $10 or $20. You want the ones from before the mid-70s. Check the foot for Made in Sweden. Then count the screws on the side plate. You want 5, not 4. When production shifted, the screw count dropped to 4. And between 2 reels in identical cosmetic shape, that single detail can mean several $100s at auction. And the lottery ticket? The black version. As the story goes, British salmon anglers refused to carry a bright red reel to their traditional rivers, so Abu built a black record for the British market. A clean, early black record, with the little fish on the foot, can bring thousands, well into 4 figures. Same machine, different color, a whole different number. And the next 3 reels make this one look cheap. Number 5 is, by many accounts, the most famous fly reel ever built, the Hardy Perfect, from Hardy Brothers of Alnwick, England. In 2014, a tiny 2¼ all-brass Perfect set a record at a British auction, £44,000, one of only a handful known to exist. Hardy is one of the rare brands where the name still tracks with quality, but the production era still decides the fortune. A hardy marquee with a hand-engraved brass foot and a tight click from the 1960s is a different financial object than a later one in shinier shape. Hardy also made the Cascapedia, a salmon reel so rare that only a small number were ever built. Here's the catch that humbles experts. Edward vom Hoff made a Cascapedia too. To authenticate the Hardy that brings new car money, you look for the rod-in-hand trademark, the straight-line perfect stamp on the face, and you date the check mechanism. Non-collectors sell these for $20 at estate sales because they just look small and old. And small and old, it turns out, is exactly where the very top of this market lives. Number 4 is where American reel-making began. Before mass production, watchmakers in Kentucky, George Snyder, around 1810, were building the first American multiplying reels by hand. Names like Meek, Milam, and Talbot set the standard for a century. These were never mass-market tools. A handmade Kentucky reel cost about a soldier's entire month of pay in the Civil War era. This was the tackle of presidents and senators. Find one in a tackle box today, and it's usually priced as a pre-industrial curiosity, because that's exactly what it looks like. The tells are precise. Read the maker's stamp on the headplate. Check for jeweled bearings on the better grades. And on the earliest reels, look for screws that were hand-numbered to match their own holes, because nothing was standardized yet. A signed, number 1 German silver Meek and Milam carries auction estimates near $3,000, and the finest pre-war Kentucky reels cross $5,000. But one filed foot, one replaced handle, and a serious buyer walks away without a word. Which brings us, finally, to the name I keep promising you. Number 3 is the holy grail of vintage tackle, and it comes down to 2 brothers you have to tell apart. Edward vom Hoff was a New York maker whose German silver and hard rubber reels are the crown jewels of American tackle. His brother Julius supplied the big sporting houses, often under badged names, like that Cosmic we found at number 7. The numbers are staggering. A Julius vom Hoffa fly reel sold for $26,200 at Lang's. And here is the twist that defies every instinct. The giant, heavy, big-game saltwater reels are not the top prize. Collectors pay the highest premiums for the smallest trout and salmon fly reels. The tell hides on the reel's own oil port. Look for the maker's stamp, often on a sliding cap, or the headplate, reading Edward vom Hoffa, Maker, New York, with a patent date. Edward is the celebrated name. Julius is the quiet bargain. Either way, authentic and original, you're holding a 4-figure reel at the floor. But whether it's worth 4 figures or 40,000, one ordinary thing decides it, and most people throw that thing straight in the trash. Number 2 isn't a reel at all. It's the box, the paperwork, the little wrench, the oil bottle, the spare parts tube. On a rare reel, it matters. On a common one, it's transformational. A loose, everyday ambassador might bring $20. That same reel, complete in its correct box with the original papers, has sold for the better part of $800. Why? Because the metal was built to last, and the cardboard was built to be thrown away. It almost always was. So the few boxes that survived are rare in a way the reel itself never could be. And there's the quiet economics again. Nobody saved the box, because nobody was ever told it was worth saving. There was no one on the selling side who made $1 from telling you. One warning: the box has to match the reel exactly. The right reel in the wrong box fools no one at the high end. So before you throw away that stained cardboard in your grandfather's garage, understand it can be worth more than the reel sitting inside it. And there's still one rule that sits above even that, the one almost everyone breaks in the first 10 minutes. Number 1, the single factor that overrides every brand, every year, every model on this list: originality. Collectors don't pay for the right reel. They pay for the untouched one. A replaced spool, a swapped handle, a repainted body, an over-polished finish. Any one of them can collapse the value dramatically. And here is where most people lose the most money. In the first 10 minutes after they find the reel, the instinct is to clean it up, polish the brass, make it presentable. That instinct destroys the premium. Collectors aren't buying a reel to fish with. They're buying a documented object. The dark, aged surface, the patina, is information. The unpolished finish is the evidence that it's real. Hit a 100-year-old German silver reel with metal polish, and you've wiped its authentication clean off the map. And spraying it down with a household lubricant before you list it, collectors will tell you, on the forums, that it can strip older finishes and leave a residue that does the surface no favors. A worn, honest reel, with matching patina across every screw, beats a shiny, restored one nearly every time. So before you price, before you donate, before you sell the whole lot, stop. Don't polish it. Don't swap a single screw. Flip the reel over and photograph the foot. Find the model. Read the country stamp. Count the side plate screws. Then search the exact model on completed sold listings, not active ones. Active is what sellers are hoping for. Sold is what buyers actually paid. They are rarely the same number, and if you're unsure, post clear photos in a vintage tackle group, the Old Reel Collectors Association, or a pre-auction thread at a house like Lang's, and ask, before you do anything at all. A reel collector answers in minutes. The picker who wants it cheap will tell you it's hard to say and offer to take it off your hands. Go back to that reel from the opening. The corroded one, the cracked knob, $20, and they'll take 10. Nothing about it has changed in the last 20-some minutes. Same metal, same scratches. What changed is that you can read it now. The window it was built in, the maker hiding under the badge, the patina that proves it's real. None of that was ever printed on the package, because the package had no reason to print it. The gap between junk and a fortune was only ever the gap between knowing and not knowing. The reel in that tackle box didn't lose its value when it stopped catching fish. It lost it the moment it left the hands of someone who knew what it was, and landed with someone who didn't. If you'd rather be the one who knows, you already understand which side of the counter you're standing on. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling the rest of it back into the light, one reel at a time.